Hey! Today we are going to create this lovely garden rose together. I've listed the exact supplies I used in the description below, but seriously, do not worry about it. Close enough is good enough. We just want to create something beautiful together and have lots of fun. You'll need 3 different shades of pinks or reds, a light green and a dark green watercolor, some watercolor paper, a pencil, and a very fine watercolor brush. If you don't have a very fine one, just take the smallest one you have. We're going to use this image as a reference, and what I want you to notice here is the dark areas where the petals meet, and also how soft and organic the shape of these petals are. So there's lots of rounds and curves. Let's start sketching then. I'm showing you here what it looks like for me to do this real time. I am quite a slow sketcher and quite a slow painter. So this is real time if you want to follow along, have an idea how I come up with this sketch. But I know that this might be a little slow for you, so I have actually decided to speed the whole thing up a bit to get more up to speed with how a lot of people might want to watch this. If that's not you and you need a tiny bit longer to follow, no problem, just pause it and catch up with me when you're ready. A few things to note here is, again, trying to make it very soft and not actually try to make it perfect. Every little leaf is going to be a tiny bit of a different shape. It's going to have some nooks and crannies. Sorry, just 2 seconds here. The quality is not so good, but I wanted you to see what I was doing in the middle there. So now we're back to better video. We are almost done with our sketch. We have the small, tighter petals in the middle, and they get softer and wider as they go towards the outside. Everything, of course, is circular around that middle. Now we're just going to add a stem. I like to add a tiny bit of a curve to mine. That's just my style. I do the same with these leaves. But you can do a stick straight one if you want. That's totally up to you. And you can add as many or few leaves as you like. I did 2 just for balance. Now we get to the fun part. Wet your brush, make it nice and wet, and then what we're basically going to do is create a little color chart. I want to see what these different reds and pinks that I picked look like, because later we're going to start to go from lightest to darkest when we paint. So pick up just a little bit of water and tons of paint to get a really dark initial impression. And then wash your brush, add mostly water, and try to thin out that paint. Again, add some more concentrated paint on the other end so you really have that nice range of what each of the colors can do. Remember to wash your brush in between, and then once you are done with the color testing for the first choice, move on to your second paint and repeat that process. Start with a super intense color, add a little bit of water, really wash it out, and see just how soft you can get this to look. One thing that is so special about the watercolor medium is that you can have some transparency. For some of the paints more than others, you're able to see the white of the paper shine through. So that is something that we're trying to test out here to just understand the range of the individual colors that you're working with. In my case, I can tell that the third one I tested is the one that has the most transparency, can be the lightest, so that is the one that I start with. What I'm doing here is the core of my process. I look at where those folds are because I know that's going to be the darkest, most saturated point. And I start applying color there in a very light manner. So I'm using a lot of water and a little pigment. Sometimes I pick up a tiny bit more pigment in that very same first step, but I actually love the variety. I find it brings a ton of life to the painting. It makes it visually so much more interesting than if you have the exact same shade on every layer in every little nook and cranny. I think it's way more fun to have a little bit of visual difference. Sometimes working with watercolor is literally waiting for the paint to dry. So I'm showing you a little trick here. Of course, I've sped up the recording for you, which is the magic of YouTube, and you won't be able to utilize that while you're painting. But what you can do is this other trick, which is to work around in a circle. You see that I'm not focused on one particular region of the rose. I move around from petal to petal to make sure that I'm always working on dry paper. This technique is not a wet on wet paper, so I do not want the colors to blend at this point. I need to be able to apply the paint to dry paper. So I just move around to whatever spot has already dried. Another little trick to get this look is to make sure that you are applying paint in only certain parts of the petal. So I don't usually take the brush and apply the same density of paint, everything from that same attempt in one go and fill the whole petal. I fill it in these rounded shapes that come out of the nooks and crannies and the base of each of the petal where it is connected to the other petals. And that is really how I start filling out. I do not do color on all 4 edges of each petal at the same time. And I always try to leave a few petals that have some white space left, because this is really going to help lighten your painting, give it some vibrancy, give it that effect of some light hitting, a more of a 3D look, and it's just incredibly beautiful, and also one of the key things about watercolor that make it so special. Now, I keep going over this. It's essentially the same process again and again, but I continue, as you see here, to change how densely I'm applying this color. So at this point, I have much more pigment and much less water on my same brush. It's still the same colors, the same 3 colors I'm using, and it is still the same brush. Nothing has really changed except how much pigment I'm using and how wet I let the brush get. I'm including everything here because if you are learning, I want you to be able to see step for step exactly how I'm placing my brush, where I'm applying the paint, and what I am doing so that you can learn through duplication and experimentation. I'll let you watch and paint along for a few minutes, and then I'll be back with some additional pointers. this is the final stage of painting the rose, painting the petals, adding that final really saturated bit of color right where all the folds are, right in the center where we saw in the reference that the petals were the darkest. Now let's move on to the stem. I do it in a very similar fashion, meaning that I take the lighter color first, the lighter green, and I am going to leave a few white areas when I paint. I do that with the stem, but especially with the leaves. I want to have basically these vines coming out within the leaves. And between that, I'm going to leave some white for the paint to breathe. Have a look what I mean right here. And then I go over it with my darker green. I, in this case, didn't mind so much if my colors were going to mix, so I did not wait for the paint to dry like I did with the rose petals. But I do still like some variety, so I'm not going to put green every single space. I'm going to leave a little bit of white, and I'm going to have areas where I only have the lighter color on the bottom and nothing else on top. And that just, again, gives it much more interest, much more variety, and the feeling of some movement, some life. And let's do this little final touch. I always love doing this. I always make the area immediately under the flower dark. Sometimes I do these extra final touches you can add too, just for kicks, to accentuate how the petals are coming out of the flower to give more of a 3D impression. If you followed this tutorial, please let me know in the comments what you thought of it, and also tag me on Instagram with your work because I would love to see the outcome.